What happened to the memories of the old world that our grandparents used to tell us? What if I told you that nearly 100 years ago, the US government documented the last voices of these people before they vanished forever? These stories never made it into history books. They're hidden in a file, stored in the Library of Congress. And inside these transcriptions, we find secrets that could change everything we think we know about the past. Let's uncover what was lost. There is a file cabinet in the Library of Congress that contains the voices of dead Americans. Not recordings, but transcriptions. Thousands of pages of handwritten and typed interviews conducted between 1936 and 1940 by government writers who were sent into homes across 24 states with a single instruction: get their stories before they're gone. The program was called the Federal Writers Project, a branch of Roosevelt's New Deal that employed unemployed journalists, novelists, and researchers to document the lives of ordinary citizens. They collected 2,900 life histories, and those stories were stored in the Library of Congress, where they sat mostly unread for almost 40 years. I found them because I was looking for something else. I was tracing architectural records from the 1870s, trying to understand why so many American courthouses and government buildings from that era had proportions that didn't match the people who supposedly used them. I kept asking the same question, but the deeper I went into those archives, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real story. The people were, because those 2,900 interviews captured something no textbook ever could: the first-hand memories of Americans who were alive before everything changed. And what they described doesn't match the history we've been taught. Let me explain what I mean by before everything changed. Consider the math. An American born in 1855 who lived to 85, not unusual, would have died in 1940. That means they were alive, speaking, remembering when those government writers knocked on their doors. They would have been children during the 1860s and 1870s. They would have witnessed the most dramatic transition in American history, not gradually, not over centuries, but within a single lifetime. And their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, heard their stories firsthand. Those grandchildren are the last generation that carries the oral history of the old world, and they're almost gone. Mary Kelly was born in 1851 in Southfield, Michigan. She lived to 113 years and died in 1964. She was alive before the Civil War and survived long enough to see television in every American home. Maggie Barnes was born to a formerly enslaved woman in the early 1880s and lived to around 111, dying in 1998 in North Carolina. These weren't extraordinary cases. The Gerontology Research Group has verified 16 supercentenarians born in the 1850s. Dozens more lived past 100. Hundreds lived past 90. An entire generation of witnesses whose memories spanned two completely different worlds. The government had the chance to record all of them. It recorded 2,900. Then it stopped. The project was defunded in 1939 after congressional hearings turned it over to state control and effectively shut it down. The interviews were boxed up, not published in any accessible form until the 1970s. 30 years of silence around the last first-hand testimony of Americans who remembered what came before. Before what exactly? That's where October 8, 1871 becomes impossible to ignore. Every American learns about the Great Chicago Fire, Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the wooden city, the rebuilding. What almost no one learns is what happened the same night at the same hour across 3 states simultaneously. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm consumed the entire town in about 1 hour. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people perished, making it the deadliest wildfire in American recorded history. The fire burned 1.2 million acres. Survivors describe winds strong enough to lift adults off the ground, flames that moved faster than a person could run, and heat so intense that people crossing open ground simply burst into flames without being touched by visible fire. Reverend Peter Perrin, the parish priest who survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River, published his eyewitness account in 1874. He described a phenomenon that doesn't match any normal wildfire behavior. The available oxygen was consumed so rapidly that people who showed no burns were found deceased, as if the air itself had been weaponized. The fire created, on the same night of the Chicago fire, something even more terrible happened in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. The fire spread with such intensity that the winds lifted adults off the ground. Flames moved faster than any human could run, and the heat was so intense that people crossing open ground simply burst into flames without being touched by visible fire. Reverend Peter Perrin, who survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River, described a situation where oxygen was consumed so rapidly that bodies without visible burns were found dead, as if the very air had become a weapon. This devastation wasn't an isolated accident. On the same night, across 3 states, a series of devastating fires erupted simultaneously. 225 million acres of the upper Midwest were consumed in a wave of destruction never before seen. But what really happened that night? What exactly caused so many fires in so many areas, with such speed and intensity? The official explanation points to a prolonged drought, lumber debris, and a cold front with strong winds. This makes sense, but what about the coincidence? The speed of the fire, the description of blue flames seen in Chicago. An unconfirmed theory suggests that fragments of Barr's comet struck the atmosphere and ignited the flames from above. This hypothesis has never been proven, but it's also never been disproven. That's where the government writers' interview transcriptions become crucial. They interviewed people who had lived through those dark days and asked what really happened. But why were these accounts never properly investigated? These testimonies are among the 2,900 stories stored at the Library of Congress. The government knew about them and still ignored them, until silence around these memories stretched for decades. And when we finally began to look at the transcriptions, we started to realize what had been hidden. These accounts speak of more than just fires. They speak of a profound change, of an old world that no longer exists, and the destruction of evidence of an alternative history. When the government writers interviewed these mostly elderly people who had been children during the Civil War and were now in their twilight years, what they heard didn't match what was in the history books. The interviewees spoke of old buildings, of proportions that didn't fit modern cities, of experiences that seemed to come from another age. And what shocked most was the silence surrounding these memories. When their children, now adults, tried to pass these stories down to their own kids, they were dismissed, ridiculed, and often ignored because they didn't fit the knowledge that schools and books taught. These accounts told of different architecture, of a society that operated in a completely different way, with building proportions and infrastructures that didn't make sense to the generations that came after. One major example of this was the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the so-called White City, which hosted over 27 million visitors over 6 months. More than 200 buildings were erected in a record time of 2 years. All of this was done by hand, without the use of modern technology. Then, after the fair, nearly all the buildings were torn down. This wasn't an isolated incident. It happened repeatedly in exhibitions around the world during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Why did this happen? Why were these monumental structures, which seemed to come from another era, built and then destroyed so quickly? The answer may lie in the transcripts that no one wanted to listen to. The memories of those who lived before the transition were being erased, systematically and deliberately. In 1933, Congress authorized the destruction of vital historical records, including the 1890 census, one of the most comprehensive in U.S. history, documenting around 63 million Americans. Only a small part survived the fire that destroyed the archives in 1921. The documents that still existed were sent to a warehouse and left there with no effort to restore them. And then, in early 1933, when Congress approved the destruction of the remaining census records, people began to realize that a major effort was underway to completely erase the evidence of a world that no longer existed. The destruction of records didn't stop there. The 1890 census was just the beginning of a larger pattern of erasure of historical traces. After the 1921 fire, the authorized destruction in 1933 left a deep gap in our understanding of a past we can no longer fully access. But what else was being erased? What was the real impact of this systematic destruction of records and memories? If we understand the magnitude of this loss, we can begin to see how the past was distorted. What's most unsettling is that by destroying these records, a crucial chapter of American history was buried. A chapter about a transition, a change that marked the foundation of the modern world. Many of these transcriptions speak of architecture that didn't make sense for the contemporary world that was beginning to emerge. The transition from classical to modern architecture, for example, was abrupt and, for the most part, ignored by history books. Those who lived before the change, those who still held the memories of the old world, saw the world with different eyes. and when they spoke about it, their words were treated as mere legends, myths, or faulty memories. But what these people were saying could not be ignored. They spoke of constructions that seemed to be from an earlier time, from a grander and more detailed world than what they were seeing around them. These accounts didn't just speak of buildings, they spoke of a worldview. The change wasn't just architectural, it was cultural, social, and technological. And when we start to view these changes not as something linear, but as a giant leap, it begins to make sense that these abrupt transitions, the shift to the modern society we know, were camouflaged by a systematic effort to erase them. And that's exactly what the documents and testimonies tried to preserve, the true memory of an era that was fading away. But what happened to these stories? Why were they ignored for so long? Why did no one take the time to dig deeper into these testimonies, these accounts of a world that existed before all the modernization we know? Now the only thing left are the memories of a generation that has almost vanished. The few survivors who still remember what happened before the Great Change are quickly disappearing. Their children and grandchildren who heard these stories couldn't preserve them. They were taught to believe what the history books said, not what their grandparents remembered. And now, almost a century later, those stories are losing their importance. But the truth is still there, in the transcriptions at the Library of Congress, waiting to be discovered, waiting for those willing to look beyond the official versions. These transcriptions, these memories, tell us something fundamental. They tell us that history is not only made by the events documented officially, but also by the details left behind. What happened before, the transition that changed everything, is present in these stories. It's in every building, in every memory, in every account of those who saw the old world before it vanished. The question is, are we ready to hear these voices? Are we willing to revisit what was lost and understand what was really erased from official history? What remains of these memories is not just a relic of the past, but a key to understanding the present. They show us that the history we were told is not the only history that exists. And if we have the courage to look, we might discover that the past we know is not the past that truly existed. The future is there, waiting to be understood. And the answers, no matter how much they cost us, are hidden in the silence of the archives, waiting to be heard.